right, this is our 1030 class, and we are going to go over object-oriented program. We're going to show you how to use a class and create an object and all that sort of stuff that you've done a little bit in Java. Now we're going to go a little bit more in depth. So let's talk about what a class is. Class is just basically the blueprint for your object. It allows you to design what your object is going to look like. Well, from that blueprint, darn it, I'm in the way again. From that blueprint, you can create several objects. So suppose you have a class toaster, you could create a Sonic the Hedgehog toaster or the bagel toaster. Doesn't matter what it is, it's all created from the same kind of blueprint. Now, your class variables are used to describe your object. So let's go to, sorry, I gotta do old school. Let's do Pac-Man. In Pac-Man, there's those little ghosts, Inky, Blinky, Winky, and Clyde or something like that. Well, if we had variables to describe them, we could have maybe their X and Y location, we could have their color, we could have their name. Those would all be variables that describe our objects. So those would be class variables. And you can use those class variables anywhere in your class. You don't have to pass them back and forth like we did with just regular functions. But if you have other variables that you need in your class, suppose you need a variable for a for loop, or suppose you need just little temporary variables, those should be local variables. You don't want any other variables that are part of your class. Well, you don't want any variables that don't describe your class in your class. You want those to be local. Okay, now a method is just a function, but it's a function that's part of a class. So when it's out in main, it's called a function. When it's in your class, it's called a method. That's the only difference between functions and methods. Realistically, they do the same thing. It's just a small segment of code. In our case, a method's going to be the action for our object. So if it were the ghost, we could have a chase method or a runaway method sort of thing. Those are the actions that the ghost perform. Okay, here is our syntax. Now, if we were to change this to struct, it would be the same exact thing as a struct. The only difference is, number one, class is now struct is now class, but now we have this additional public and private, and all of our actions are going to be public, and all of our properties, our variables, are going to be private. Now, your constructor can go in the class as well. That's going to go public, and usually we put that the first thing. So if we have a class called class name, then our constructor would be called class name. If we had a class called Pokemon, which we will, then we'll have a constructor called Pokemon. Has to match exactly, case sensitive and everything. And what our constructor will allow us to do is it will let us set default variables in our class. Now you notice this has a semicolon on it. And the reason that is there is because in our class, this is going to be in a .h file, a header file. We're only going to put our function prototypes. We're going to have a separate file to have all of our functions. And that way we don't have one huge long gazillion line of code file. We have several files that will help us find our information faster. So here's an example of the Pokemon battle program that we're going to code later on today. So here it's class Pokemon. We know this is the constructor because it's the same name as class. But now wait, look at this. We have another constructor. We're going to show you how to do overloaded constructors. We're going to show you how to do, here's a couple of, there's a getter, there's another getter. If you remember from Java, you had getters and setters. Here's kind of a take damage method. There's an action. And then here we have our private variables. We'll go into this more in detail when we do the coding together for the no-brainer. Okay, now in the .h file that had the class, this is an example of what the constructor looks like in the .cpp file. It's going to have the name of the class, and it's just going to set all your default variables, but it has this weird thing over here. This bring out the next click because I got the animation here and I'm once again in the way. This is called your scope resolution operator. We've seen it before when sometimes you do the using namespace std, but sometimes you can do using std colon colon and then whatever object you're going to do. That's kind of like what we're doing here. We're specifying that this constructor is part of the Pokemon class. And we're going to do that with every single one of our functions. So here's an example of some of our getters. So here we're returning an int value of their HP, and it's part of the Pokemon class, and the function is called getHP. So if we look down at this one's going to look exactly the same, only instead of it get HP, it's get strength, and it's going to be returning strength. Okay, now once you have your class created, this is like in main, we would want to use the object. We want to declare and instantiate the object. So here's an example of how you would do it. Just like Java for the most part, only you don't have to use the new operator. You can just say Pokemon and then name your Pokemon whatever you want. So this becomes the object. Now whenever we want to use our object, we use whatever we name it. So here I have Mewtwo.setStrength or Mewtwo.takeDamage, that sort of stuff. And anytime you call any of the methods, it's always with the object name. Okay, catch us in the next video and I'll go into and we'll discuss a little bit more of object-oriented programming.